So is China a democracy is the question. Yes. I mean, the easiest way to prove that is over 90% of Chinese people support their government, right? And people say that's due to propaganda. And I mean, yeah, on some level, the media has an effect, and the propaganda of the Communist Party does have an effect. But there's only so much that you can propagandize your people into supporting your government. Like the United States is one of the most propagandized countries on earth. But, 17% of people think Congress is doing a good job. Most people are aware that our government is failing us, that our system is failing us. Whereas in China, 90% of people support the government, and that's not just because they're brainwashed. It's because every generation in China has inherited much, much, much better material conditions than the generation before them, and they've had far more opportunities than the generation before them, which in the US, now we're seeing maybe for the first time in history, a generation of kids who has less opportunities than their parents and way less opportunities than their grandparents. Well, I mean, if our parents have less opportunities than their grandparents, then that would mean we're not the first generation to have less than the one before us. But you get what I'm saying. We've been moving in that direction. The retirement age is literally going up. It is going up. So as we automate more labor, and as we have an economy that can, be more automated, and we have to do less dangerous and harmful jobs, people are working more. Right. And that's because of the contradictory nature of the system. So basically, I don't know how I got onto that rant, but you can't trick people into supporting, you can't just brainwash people into supporting your political system if your political system is failing them and trapping them in debt. So the fact that so many Chinese people support their government is the ultimate proof that they are in fact a democracy or a dictatorship of the proletariat or the popular classes. But Sebastian here gets a little bit more in depth, and I recommend people check out Roland Bohr's Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, a guide for foreigners. It's one of the best links between the English-speaking world and China. And Xi Jinping and the party have recently been making an effort to teach Westerners more about China, because I mean, they used to do none of that. China didn't care, right? Americans didn't know what was going on. A lot of communists thought they were actually moving towards capitalism because they wouldn't share what their strategy was. And on some level, it needed to remain secret because they were allowing private capital into their country, and they were going to try and use it to build socialism, as they have. And they, didn't necessarily want to give their strategy away to the CIA. But yeah, now we know a lot more about China thanks to the recent efforts of the party and the recent efforts of thinkers like Roland Bohr, who I think is really great. But yeah, he gets into the specifics of how it works. Basically, at least economically, there are party cadre, people who work for the Communist Party of China or within it, who are responsible for each geographic area. Both, combating political corruption and getting people's input on how they want things to be run politically, but more importantly, finding out what people need economically, finding out what they need in terms of material goods. So like early on in China, this meant going around and making sure that every place, had enough housing, right? The party cadre would make sure that every place has enough housing, and then they would report back to the Central Committee. And then the Central Committee could create economic plans that would bring more housing to the area that needed more housing, right? This is how they do central planning. And a lot of these positions are obviously elected by the people, a lot of these party positions, or elected within the party, depending. So again, way more democracy than what we have here in the US, where the Democrats can literally just appoint Kamala Harris without her receiving a single vote. But they report back to the Central Committee, and then the economy can be planned based on what people need. So back then it was like housing and stuff like that. But now it's like Wi-Fi, right? This rural region doesn't have Wi-Fi. Well, okay, let's plan the economy to make sure that they have full universal free Wi-Fi in that place, which is like, paying $80 a month for Wi-Fi here in the US. Like, oh my goodness. Please, let's do central economic planning and nationalize these stupid ass companies like Mediacom. But anyways, so basically the party and the central leadership is responsible to the people at every level. And There was corruption in the party in the 90s, mostly like corporations and private entities bribing party members to do their bidding instead of doing the will of the people. But then in the 2010s, in the last decade, a massive anti-corruption effort was launched by Xi Jinping, and public trust in the party had reached an all-time low in China. And after these anti-corruption efforts, public trust in the party is up to over 90%. Because they've been so successful, that distrust of the party has been pretty much done away with, because anyone who was corrupt was just thrown out. You know, it was like Stalin's purges, but more less people being shot. And there wasn't a world war going on, so it was, you know, it wasn't something where they needed to get these people out immediately because they might be spying for the Nazis. But anyways, that was super effective in China and increased the level of democracy, right? Like there's levels of democracy. It's dialectical, like and you know, do we even want full democracy? Do people want to make every single, or, you know, vote on every single little decision that a country makes? No, sometimes you just want, you know, a leadership that you trust to make certain decisions. But you know, they have much more control over their what happens economically. They have much more control over what happens politically. They have much more control over who the politicians that run their country are. Yeah, that was kind of a long ramble, but I mean, too, the other thing is, like, this is the failure of liberalism and the Enlightenment. Is the Enlightenment basically says we're no longer going to be ruled by the divine right of kings. We're not going to be ruled by monarchs. We need to be ruled by democracy and by logos, by our logic and our reason. Well, that is good, but you can't have a government that's governed by logic and reason when you have a capitalist economy, because the capitalist economy is illogical. It's not reasonable. It's not doing what's best for everybody. It's doing what's best for profits. So the people who accumulate the profits and control all the wealth are then going to use that wealth to control the political system. And then the political system becomes irrational from the perspective of the entire working class, which is the American political system right now is a perfect example. So you can't have political democracy really without economic democracy. If all the media is owned by, you know, a handful of corporations, and then all of the necessary means of life, all of the housing, all of the food, all of the water, all of the farmland is controlled by the same people, and those people in the US at least are legally allowed to bribe the government, which is what Citizens United did. It made it so corporate money and corporate political spending was protected by free speech laws, so they could spend as much as they want. You have corporations literally bribing the government, and then lobbying groups are the ones writing the bills that the government, you know, pushes, and corporate think tanks are the ones writing the stories and the talking points that the corporate-owned news then pushes. When you have a situation like this where the means of communication and the means of production are owned by a handful of people in the same class, the capitalist class, how are you supposed to have a democracy? Like, obviously, those people are going to manipulate the political system and the media and the cultural superstructure in order to benefit themselves, in order to do what's good for them. And because they're a minority of society, because they don't make up the majority, and because their interests are actually diametrically opposed in many ways to the interests of the majority, they're going to end up screwing the majority over and over and over and over and over again. And this, you know, government that we were supposed to have based on rationality is nothing like the U.S. government is nothing like the ideals that were laid out in the Constitution, being, you know, a government of, by, and for the people, or the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, being a government of, by, and for the people, and, you know, having this right to life and pursuit of happiness, or even, you know, some of the things that were put into the amendments later on, like freedom of speech. You know, we don't live up to any of these ideals, and the reason is because of our economic system, because of capitalism. So the real reason China's a true democracy is because they control their economic system, because they control production. And that in turn allows them to create the kind of political system that they want. Although production did get a little out of control in the 90s, which is when all that corruption happened. That was when they were allowing more private entities in, and they ran a little bit wild, and you had some corruption, but thankfully they recalibrated.